Hello, this is Michael Truscello. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but hopefully this video is a sort of adequate replacement. Um, this is a brief discussion of a small part of an article that I'm writing for South Atlantic Quarterly, and that article should be out next year if you are interested in this topic and discussion. I'm just going to address a very small part of the article, the internet shutdown and revolutionary politics. And the very simple and general idea that I want to translate here is the idea that the internet shutdown is another example of the primarily authoritarian sort of tendencies of the internet as a socio-technical assemblage. And I'm going to reference some other scholars on this sort of broad idea that the internet is an extension of colonialism. It is an extension of capitalism and other authoritarian institutions. And the general idea that I would put forward, something that I sort of referenced in my book a couple of years ago, is the idea that the sort of leftist answer to the internet will not emerge from the internet itself. And I will clarify that in the following comments. One of the problems with the scholarship on internet shutdowns, at least in years past, it's sort of changing now, but in years past, there has been a tendency to ignore the ways in which democracies use digital repression just as much as more autocratic governments do. And I think that emphasis is changing, but I'll still point out a couple of recent examples that tend to emphasize as case studies of internet shutdowns and other forms of digital repression, autocracies in a way that deflects attention from the ways in which democracies also use these repressive strategies. And the other thing I want to emphasize here is that the internet shutdown is becoming a more common tactic used by primarily by nation states. And it is used in conjunction with other forms of digital repression. And sometimes that makes it difficult to define the internet shutdown because there are so many sort of gradations of shutting off networked communication and censoring and channeling information and so forth. But the internet shutdown is sort of its own thing, and it's usually for a limited period of time. Stephen Feldstein talks about this briefly in his recent book, The Rise of Digital Repression. This is actually an author in a book that I would classify as not the radical response to the internet shutdown. The author in this case worked for the US State Department for 3 years, and so not surprisingly has a kind of liberal assessment of digital repression. But as he correctly notes, there is some murkiness when it comes to delineating exactly what constitutes an internet shutdown versus an associated network restriction like censorship filtering. The critical component he identifies here is the time-bound nature of the internet shutdown. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Early in the discussion of internet shutdowns, there was, I think, a sense that it was actually not in the best interests of an authoritarian regime that is facing an insurrection in the so-called dictator's dilemma. It was actually not in the best interests of the regime to shut down networked communications. And that was based on the famous example of the Hosni Mubarak regime in Egypt in 2011, who they sort of gradually shut down the internet, and that actually backfired because it sent more people into the streets to get information and sort of join in the insurrection. But I think what has become clearer in later years is that nation states are now better equipped to deal with insurrection involving networked communications. So the Egyptian government was basically caught by surprise at that time. Very few nation states today would be caught by surprise in the same way. So a limited time internet shutdown is becoming a much more common tactic. And even though sometimes these shutdowns are regional in nature, the national shutdowns are the ones that occur most frequently. Here are some numbers from 2020. India by far uses the internet shutdown most frequently. But as I said, there's a tendency to deflect from the ways in which democracies also use digital repression. So I would emphasize in talking about the internet shutdown exactly what is being shut down. And the recent book by Jonathan Crary, Scorched Earth, Beyond the Digital Age to a Post-Capitalist World, I think is very useful in this way. In fact, I agree with most of what he writes about the internet and its connection to the sort of life-destroying systems of capitalism. But I would just make a couple of exceptions. He doesn't, I don't think he properly identifies some people who have made a similar argument years prior to his book, including some notable communication scholars that I will reference in a moment. But the overall argument is, I think, agreeable. He says the internet complex, as he calls it, as he refers to this total assemblage, is a magnification and consolidation of arrangements that have been operative or partially realized for many years. The truth is irrefutable. There are no revolutionary subjects on social media. Again, I'll just reiterate that very general idea that the answer to the internet will probably not emerge from within the internet. I think we have to think outside of it and think of the infrastructures that make the internet possible. So Crary's argument is that capitalism is now in its terminal scorched earth phase. In a general sense, a scorched earth is one on which thriving regions have been reduced to a state of barrenness and have lost their capacity for regeneration. He believes pathways to a different world will not be found by internet search engines. And I agree, and I actually said something very similar to that in my book 2 years earlier. And I don't expect Jonathan Crary to be reading my book. I just want to sort of outline how there have been a few people who have gestured in this direction years prior to Crary's book. As good as it is, he should probably map out the literature, excuse me, as it exists. I wrote that given a choice of trying to meme one's way out of late stage capitalism or organizing to disrupt extractive industries and sabotage the pipelines, roads, and railways, the facile and popular response tends to involve a laptop and not a pickaxe. So, you know, I really do think, I thought back then, and I still think now, and I think Crary's argument reinforces this, is that attacking the infrastructures that make possible the internet complex, as he calls it, is a necessary strategy and more likely to be a winning strategy than trying to sort of win the internet through endless conflict with bots and trolls and such. but one is still necessary, but I don't think it will produce the ultimate desired result for a revolutionary left. One of the books that I think Crary should have mentioned, but doesn't, is Couldry and Mejias' book on the costs of connection. And this is one of the sort of notable books that connects the internet and surveillance capitalism, or whatever you want to call this, with colonialism and its extensive history. And he acknowledges that it's the communication infrastructures of the past 30 years that have made this all possible. I like their phrase of colonialism's enduring function as like what all of this data colonialism is doing, what it's doing through the internet, that it's a continuation of these things. And of course, you could continue to go back to other essential research on the ways in which the internet is a continuation of colonialism. And I would point to these books as essential reading, of course. I would say recent sort of liberal attempts to deal with internet authoritarianism are less successful in the sort of answers that they propose. They don't propose very useful solutions, because I think we're well past any sort of stage of minor policy reforms trying to rein in the authoritarian tendencies online. But this would require a much more detailed discussion, and that's something that I'll try to do in the article for South Atlantic Quarterly next year. Thank you very much for your time, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.